Good afternoon, everyone. It is December 28th. Going to talk about news coming out of Ukraine as well as do a small map update at the end of this video. Now, recent drone footage from Ukraine taken on December 27th reveals yet another heinous act by Russian forces, this time involving the cold-blooded execution of Ukrainian prisoners of war near Robotyne. The video shows Russian soldiers shooting 3 unarmed Ukrainian soldiers as they were being held prisoner. The Russians then continue to shoot their lifeless bodies. I'm not going to show the video because that is a very quick way to catch a ban on this app. Now, this horrifying act prompted the Ukrainian Prosecutor General's office to launch an investigation into these egregious violations of the laws of war because it is considered premeditated murder by the Russian forces. This is not the first time an incident like this has taken place, though, as 2 weeks ago we saw footage of Russian soldiers using Ukrainian POWs as human shields near Robotyne. Now, moving on, in case you were wondering who benefited the most from the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam back in June, it is clearly the Russians. And I said that before, it was definitely the Russians that benefited most. The subsequent flooding killed hundreds of innocent people, but also unfortunately delayed a Ukrainian operation to cross the Dnipro River. This crossing was likely a critical element in supporting Ukraine's counteroffensive strategies. The Ukrainians were actually planning a major crossing in late May of 2023. However, the unexpected destruction of the dam resulted in extensive flooding and forced the postponement of the Ukrainian operation. Instead, Ukrainian forces made several limited attempts to cross the river in the following months of July, August, and September, but they were largely unsuccessful, and it wasn't until mid-October of 2023 that Ukrainian forces undertook a more substantial effort to establish a foothold on the eastern bank of the river, which they still hold. The delay bought Russia enough time to send reinforcements to the Kherson region to halt any Ukrainian advances across the river. Russia recognized its tactical weakness here, and they used the dam to stop any possible Ukrainian amphibious landings, which would have been detrimental to the left flank of the Russian forces. Now, moving on, the recent U.S. weapons package for Ukraine, which is valued at $250 million, is likely the last package that we will give Ukraine until further funding is approved by Congress. It includes artillery shells, air defense systems, anti-aircraft and anti-tank missiles, and small arms ammunition. Now, while President Zelensky expressed gratitude for this support, emphasizing the U.S.'s key role in the international coalition aiding Ukraine, there are definite concerns about the future of aid coming from the U.S. Ukrainian lawmakers pointed out that the aid might only provide short-term relief and is not going to significantly alter the battlefield dynamics or strengthen Ukraine's resistance. Now, Ukraine isn't sitting on its hands, and for its part, it is now producing 3 times more battlefield equipment, ammunition, and general war supplies than it was just 2 years ago. But this alone is not enough to overcome Russia's numerical advantages. To counter this, Ukraine has proposed mobilizing 500,000 conscripts, but the cost of which would be around $13 billion, and without Western aid, they are unsure of how to fund such a call-up. The Ukrainian finance minister has said they are locating alternate funding sources, but are not revealing where they could come from. The European Union, for its part, is developing a contingency plan to support Ukraine with up to 20 billion euros in aid, circumventing Hungary's veto. The model involves EU member states issuing guarantees to the EU budget, allowing the European Commission to borrow up to 20 billion for Ukraine next year. This approach resembles what they did for the COVID pandemic and would not require a unanimous approval from all EU members, thus bypassing Hungary's veto. They're aiming to secure this aid by March. Now, let's go take a look at the map. So as we look at the map here of eastern Ukraine, it's worth noting that much of what I'm going to talk about is Russia making gains, taking ground. The reality for Ukraine is because of a slowdown of Western aid, they've had to evaluate their positions on the battlefield, and maintaining fighters so far forward with a lack of artillery means that those fighters could be cut off and lost, and Ukrainians don't want to do that. So they are withdrawing from various areas on the battlefield to more defensible positions that they can continue to attrit Russian forces in the hopes that the U.S. Congress will get its act together and more aid will start flowing in which case the Ukrainians can re-engage in an offensive capacity, likely after winter breaks. Now, starting up north, we can look at Kupiansk, which not a lot of movement here. Originally, the Russians were trying to push hard along this entire front, specifically to take Kupiansk and cut off this roadway here. They were somewhat successful in the early going of doing that, but the Ukrainians have driven them back, and now Kupiansk has somewhat stagnated. There's not a lot of movement by either side. The reason is because there's a river that runs through here, as well as the Russians have to run up high ground here to try and take Kupiansk, so there really isn't a lot of movement here for either side. Now, when we move to the south, we can take a look at the Bakhmut area here and see that there has been some movement, some ground taken by the Russians here. So obviously we have Bakhmut up here. Ukraine had moved from Andriivka towards this road. They had taken this and were cutting off supply lines for the Russia here in their ability to resupply the front line, and had taken this. There's a railroad that actually runs through here too. The Ukrainians had this railroad to their back, which was a significant logistics movement, transportation, whatever you want to call it, loss for Russia. However, because of the position that a lack of artillery shells has put Ukraine in, they have once again fallen back towards this line here that was on the other side of the railroad. So they're using the railroad as their cover. Now that means this rail line is still not active, but this road has been reopened for Russian use. That being said, it's largely probably pre-sighted in and is very precarious for the Russians to use such a road to resupply Bakhmut or resupply their front line. But nonetheless, the Ukrainians have had to fall back from that road to the rail line in this region, and it looks like any kind of movement towards Bakhmut is stalled out right now for the Ukrainians, at least during the winter months. Now, moving further south, we look at Avdiivka. This is a place where the Russians continue to just lose huge amounts of soldiers, anywhere between 500 and 800 soldiers per day. Massive equipment losses, and they're really not taking anything. The last bit that Russia took was a few months ago. They took this mound that sits right here. Now, this mound does provide overwatch of most of the city, but they aren't doing anything with it because this mound is pre-sighted in by Ukrainian drones, etc. So any kind of equipment that gets put up there is automatically destroyed. Russia still wants to conduct a double envelopment, also known as a pincher move, to try to cut off Avdiivka from the Ukrainian forces that are flowing in as reinforcements. But they've been unable to do so. Really, the only movement that Russia has seen in this region are just small little outcroppings that they're taking from the Ukrainians in the southern part of Avdiivka. Nothing significant at this point. Now, moving further south, there really isn't a lot of movement on the front lines when you look at places like Novodonetsk, but getting further down into Robotyne right here, that is where a large portion of Ukrainian forces have had to retreat from multiple locations in order to be better secured for a defensive operation. If you remember, Ukraine was knocking on the door of Kopani. They had entered and taken Novoprokopivka and had entered the far western parts of Verbova, as well as were conducting operations up in Novopokrovka, and they've lost much of that. So just broadly, we can say that the Ukrainians have had to withdraw from essentially this line right through here. And you can see the territory that was gained. It's not a huge amount, but with the Ukrainians falling back, a lot of this was a part of the summer offensive, and losing that is somewhat of a morale killer. But the ground, the terrain here surrounding Robotyne is more conducive to a defense against any kind of movements that the Russians would be making in this direction. Now, finally, we'll move over towards Kherson and see what is going on over there, as there's not really much going on up in the region here of Zaporizhia. So we'll focus on Kherson. I'll zoom out a bit too. Now, with regard to Kherson operations, the Ukrainians have maintained a foothold on the eastern bank of the Dnieper River here. And you can see the yellow is where this bridgehead has been formed, and it runs from just to the east of Oleshki all the way to Krinky, and the Ukrainians here have established a foothold. Now, the reason the Russians aren't able to move the Ukrainians off this position is because the artillery that supports the Russians in this region is coming from North Korea, the shells, and those shells are hugely ineffective. In fact, we've seen many guns blow up because the shells were so shoddily made. The problem is the Ukrainians haven't been able to really move off their ground either because of a lack of Western aid, and this is where we may see some more of a stagnant situation until either side can be provided aid. If Western aid is approved and they can get shells to this region, we probably will see more amphibious incursions, as much of the Russians have not reinforced this very robustly relative to what we've seen up in Avdiivka or Robotyne.